There is a hill in southern Iraq that is not a hill. It rises from the flat plain like the back of something sleeping, and if you climbed it, you would find, packed inside, the crushed remains of houses stacked on houses, floors laid over older floors, walls that once held families and were smoothed flat and built upon again. It is not earth. It is a city, folded into itself across thousands of years, dissolved back into the ground it was pulled from. And here is the strange thing that has kept people awake over it. Somewhere at the very bottom of a mound like this one, or under a plain no one has dug, lies the first of them. The first place where human beings chose to live crowded among strangers. The first city ever built. We do not know its name. We may never know its name, because the people who founded it could not yet write, and by the time anyone could, that first beginning was already old, already buried, already turned to a rumor about a hill. So, before you let yourself drift, take a moment for a like and a quiet subscribe. Only if something here makes you want to linger. And if you feel moved to, leave in the comments where you are and how late it is where you're resting. I like to think of all the small lamps sharing this same night with us. The question sounds simple when you first say it aloud. Where was the first city? A child could ask it. And yet, it may be one of the most quietly unanswerable questions in all of human history. Not because the answer is hidden by anyone, but because the answer keeps moving. Every generation of people who dig into these mounds finds something older underneath what the last generation called the beginning. The first city is not a fixed place waiting to be found. It behaves more like a horizon. The closer you walk toward it, the further back it slides, until you begin to wonder whether it is a place at all, or only a threshold, a moment when something changed in how people lived together, a moment that left no monument saying here, this was the first. Consider what a city even is, and how slippery that word becomes the moment you press on it. A village is a cluster of families who mostly know one another. A city is something else. A city is the first time in the human story that a person could walk down a lane and pass 100 faces they had never seen and would never see again. It is the invention of the stranger. It is the invention of the crowd. Somewhere, at some unremembered hour, a settlement grew large enough that its people could no longer hold every neighbor in their minds, and something new was born. Not just more people, but a different kind of human loneliness and a different kind of human possibility. That threshold is what we are chasing when we chase the first city, and thresholds do not fossilize. The oldest of these mounds sit along the rivers of the Near East, the Tigris and the Euphrates, in the land the Greeks would much later call Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers. They are called tells. In Turkey, the same kind of mound is called a höyük, in Persian a tepe, and the words matter because each of them names the same quiet truth. A tell is not a natural feature. It is what a city becomes when it is built of mud and left to time. People built with brick made from river clay and straw, dried in the sun because stone was scarce and the earth was generous. Those bricks are strong enough to raise a wall and weak enough that rain, given centuries, will take them back. A house lasts a generation or two, then slumps. Rather than clear the ruin, people leveled it and built on top. And so the ground rose, layer by layer, life by life, until the living were walking on the roofs of their great-great-grandparents' rooms. That is the first haunting detail, and it is worth sitting with in the dark. The first cities did not fall in fire and leave dramatic ruins for us to admire. Most of them simply melted. They dissolved back into the plain so gently that for thousands of years no one knew a city had ever stood there. Travelers rode past low brown hills without a second glance. Only in the last 2 centuries did anyone cut into them and understand that these were not hills at all, but the compressed autobiography of a place, written in collapsed clay, waiting. And when the diggers reached the bottom of some of these mounds, they did not find bare ground where the story politely began. They found more. Older floors, older hearths, older walls beneath the ones they thought were oldest. The beginning kept refusing to arrive. It was as if the plain itself was saying that whatever you have named the first, there was something before it, and something before that, and the true first has slipped down past where your shovels reach. There is a specific mound that has drawn people back to this question again and again, one the Sumerians themselves pointed to when they were asked where everything began. They had an answer. They wrote it down thousands of years ago in the oldest lists we possess. And their answer was a single name, a place they insisted was the first city that ever was, older than kings, older than memory, a city where, they said, order itself came down from the sky. But before that name can be spoken, there is a stranger and gentler puzzle to sit with, a town so old and so large and so unlike a city that even now no one is quite sure whether it counts as the first city or as something the word city was never built to describe. On a high plain in what is now central Turkey, beside an old bed of a river that has since wandered off, there is a double mound that rose from a marsh 9,000 years ago and more. It is called Çatalhöyük, and to walk through what has been uncovered of it is to feel the word city bend in your hands. Somewhere between 5,000 and 8,000 people may have lived here, pressed together in a honeycomb of mud brick rooms, at a time so early that most of humanity was still following herds and seasons across open land. By the standards of its age it was enormous. It was a crowd made solid, and yet almost everything that later ages would think a city must have, it did not have. There were no streets. That single absence is difficult to hold in the mind at first, because a city without streets seems like a contradiction. But the houses of Çatalhöyük shared walls with their neighbors on every side, packed edge to edge with no lanes between them, so that the town was one continuous mass of rooms. People did not walk between the houses. They walked over them. The roofs were the roads. A person crossed the town along its rooftops in the open sun, then climbed down through a hole in their own ceiling, down a wooden ladder into the smoke-darkened room where they lived. The doorway was in the sky. Every home was entered by descending into it, and there was something else missing, something that unsettles our whole idea of how cities are supposed to work. There was no center, no palace rose above the rooftops, no temple square gathered the crowd, no grand building announced that here sat the powerful and there labored the ruled. House after house was roughly the same size, held roughly the same things, buried its dead in roughly the same way. For a settlement of thousands of souls, that is deeply strange. Everything we assume about crowded human life, that it needs a ruler, a hierarchy, someone at the top holding it together, seems not to have applied here. Thousands of people lived pressed against one another for well over 1,000 years, and they left almost no sign of anyone being in charge. This is why the argument over Çatalhöyük has never fully settled, and why it matters for the question of the first city. If a city means monuments and kings and a clear order of who commands whom, then this place, for all its size, was something else. An overgrown village, a crowd that never became a state. But if a city means simply the thing itself, the sheer fact of thousands of strangers living wall to wall, then Çatalhöyük was already a city long before anyone in Mesopotamia laid the first brick of the places we usually crown. The answer depends entirely on what we decide the word is allowed to mean, and that decision is ours, not the past's. The people who lived there did not know they were early. They did not know they were a question, they were simply home. What did hold such a place together, if not a king? That is the puzzle that will not let go. A settlement of thousands cannot run on nothing. There must be some agreement, spoken or unspoken, some shared sense of how a person behaves when they can no longer know everyone around them. And the clues that survive point not to a throne, but to something stranger and more intimate, woven into the very floors on which the living slept. For under those floors lay the dead. In house after house at Çatalhöyük, the people buried their own beneath the raised platforms where they ate and slept and made love and dreamed. A grandmother folded into the earth beneath the bed. A child tucked below the hearth. The living lay down each night on top of the bodies of those who had lain there before them, generation resting upon generation, the dead and the living sharing the same few square meters of clay. Some of the skulls were later dug up again, carefully and plastered, the features of a face rebuilt in clay over the bare bone, painted and passed among the living, held perhaps before being returned to the ground. It is easy from a warm distance to find this grim. But sit with it a moment in the quiet and it becomes something else. These were people who did not send their dead away to a separate ground beyond the walls. They kept them close, underfoot, part of the house, part of the family that still ate above them. Memory was not a monument you visited, it was the floor you walked on. And maybe that is a clue to how such a place held together without a ruler. The order that bound them may not have come from above, from a palace, but from below, from the ancestors sleeping in the clay, from the weight of everyone who had come before, pressing gently up through the floorboards of the living. They walked on their dead the way we walk on our cities, without thinking of the layers beneath our feet. And then, after more than 1,000 years, they left. We do not fully know why. The climate shifted, perhaps. The marsh changed. The reasons that draw people to a place and the reasons that finally drive them out are rarely written down. The rooftops emptied. The ladders rotted. The rain came year after year and did what rain does to mud brick. The great honeycombs slumped and softened and rose into a smooth brown mound above the plain. And the name the people had called their home, for they surely called it something, was never written, and so it was lost completely, forever. We do not know what they called the first great gathering of humankind. We had to give it a name ourselves, thousands of years too late. And that silence, that missing name, is not an accident of this one place. It is the shape of the whole mystery, and it points toward a far older monument, standing on a ridge to the south, built by people who raised stone before anyone thought to raise a city at all. Rise now above the plains and travel back further still, to a low ridge in the southeast of Turkey, near the old headwaters of the rivers, where the land looks out over what would one day become the cradle of cities. Here, buried under a hill for more than 10,000 years, stood rings of great stone pillars, T-shaped, some of them taller than a person and heavier than an elephant, carved with foxes and boars and vultures and scorpions in low relief, their smooth stone faces staring out across a world that had not yet learned to farm. The place is called Göbekli Tepe, and when its stones were first understood, they rearranged the whole story we had told ourselves about how everything began. The old story went like this. First, people learned to farm. Farming let them settle and store grain, and settling let them gather in numbers, and numbers led to towns, and towns to cities, and only then, once life was secure and organized and fed, did humanity have the leisure to build temples and gods and raise stone to the sky. Comfort first, then the sacred. Settlement first, then the monument. It was a tidy sequence, and it felt like common sense. Göbekli Tepe broke it, because these enormous carved pillars were raised by people who had not yet learned to farm. They were hunters and gatherers, moving with the wild herds, and yet somehow, together, they quarried and shaped and stood up rings of monoliths that would have taken hundreds of hands working in concert to move. Sit with the strangeness of that. Before the field, before the granary, before the first permanent house we would call a home, human beings were already gathering in large numbers in one place to build something that served no shelter, grew no food, kept out no cold. It was not a village. Nobody seems to have lived there, not at first. It was a place people came to, a place worth the enormous labor of the carrying and the carving. And that suggests something that turns the whole question of the first city on its head. Maybe what first drew crowds of strangers together in one place was not the need to live, but the need to gather. Not the field, but the meeting. Not survival, but the something we do not have a good word for. Or belonging, the pull to stand in a ring of others under the same carved sky. If that is true, then the city may have been born backwards from how we imagined. Perhaps people first came together for reasons that had nothing to do with living side by side, and only afterward, having tasted what it was to be many, did they begin to stay. The temple before the town, the gathering before the home. And that raises a question with no easy flaw beneath it. When we look for the first city, what exactly are we looking for the first of? The first place people lived crowded together? Or the first place they chose to come together at all, for something larger than themselves? There is one more detail about Göbekli Tepe that lingers in the mind long after the lamps are out. It did not simply fall to ruin and get forgotten. At some point, its builders or their descendants deliberately buried it. They filled the great stone rings with rubble and earth by hand, packing their own monument back into the hill, hiding the carved faces from the sky they had been raised to watch. No one is certain why. To end something, to protect something, to close a door that had served its purpose. We only know that the burial was chosen, careful, complete, and that it kept the stones safe and secret for 10,000 years until, in our own age, a plough snagged on a buried pillar and the hill gave up what it had been asked to keep. That single act should stay with anyone chasing the first city. Here, at the very dawn of the whole story, people took the greatest thing they had built and put it into the earth on purpose. They understood burial. They understood ending. And it makes you wonder how many other beginnings were closed the same way, folded back into the ground by the very hands that made them, sealed so well that no plough will ever find them, no name attached, no record kept. The first city may not have been lost by accident at all. It may have been let go the way these people let go of their temple, deliberately, gently, and without a word we could ever read. And consider what the carving alone tells us, apart from the burial. To cut a leaping fox or a coiled scorpion or a spread-winged vulture into hard stone, using only tools of stone, is the work of many days by a skilled hand, and there are hundreds of such figures across the pillars. Someone had to feed those hands while they worked. Someone had to bring water and grain to the carvers and the haulers to sustain a large gathering of people doing labor that grew no food and built no shelter for weeks or months or years at a time. That simple necessity, the feeding of a crowd assembled for a purpose beyond survival, may itself be one of the pressures that first drove people toward farming and staying and gathering in numbers. The monument may not have come after the settled life. The monument may have helped to summon it, drawing people together in such numbers for such long stretches that staying near it and learning to feed the crowd became the seed from which settled life. And eventually the city slowly grew. The temple, in that reading, is not a luxury the first towns could finally afford. It is closer to a cause. But Göbekli Tepe, for all its scale and all its stone, was not a place to live. Its builders came and gathered and went back out into the wide world, home to the open land. So, the oldest question remains just ahead of us, unanswered. Where did people first stop coming and going and simply stay? Where did the crowd first put down walls and roofs and stay long enough to raise their children in the same rooms their parents had raised them? For that, we have to leave the ridge and its buried faces and go down into a green hollow beside a spring, to a place whose name has echoed for so long that most people think they already know it, a place that was already ancient when Çatalhöyük was young, ringed by the oldest wall human beings ever built. The green hollow lies far to the south in the valley of the Jordan, where a spring has poured clear water up out of the ground for longer than there have been people to drink it. Around that spring, more than 11,000 years ago, human beings settled and did not leave. The place is Jericho, and beneath the town that would later fill the pages of Scripture lies something far older and far stranger. The remains of a settlement so ancient that when its people were alive, the last ice age had only just released its grip on the world. They built round houses of mud. They buried their dead beneath the floors, as the people of Çatalhöyük would do thousands of years afterward, plastering skulls and setting shells into the eye sockets to give the dead a gaze. And around their homes, At a moment when nowhere else on Earth had anything like it, they raised a wall. That wall is one of the most quietly astonishing things human hands have ever made, because of when it was made and because of what it required. To build a wall around a settlement is not the labor of one family. It is the labor of a community that has decided, together, that it is a single thing worth defending or defining, that there is an inside and an outside, an us that the wall encloses. It means shared work with no immediate meal at the end of it, work for the whole rather than the household. And into that same early moment they added something even more mysterious. Against the inside of the wall they built a tower. A great cone of stone, wide at the base, climbing several times the height of a person with a stairway hidden inside it, worn steps spiraling up through the dark to the top. No one knows with certainty what the Tower of Jericho was for. That uncertainty is the whole heart of the matter, and it should not be smoothed over. For a long time people assumed the obvious. A wall and a tower must mean defense, watchmen scanning for enemies, a fortress at the dawn of war. But the more closely the stones were studied, the less that easy answer held. The wall may have been raised as much against floods and mud as against men. And the tower faces inward, into the town, not out toward any approaching danger. Some who have studied it wonder whether it was something stranger than a fort, a marker of time perhaps, aligned so that, on a certain evening near the longest day of the year, the shadow of a nearby mountain would fall across it exactly, a great stone finger of the landscape touching the tower to mark the turning of the year, a calendar of shadow, a place to stand and feel the sky keep its appointments. Whether or not that is true, the deeper point remains. At the very beginning of settled human life, in one of the oldest gatherings we have ever found, people did not only build houses to shelter their bodies. They built something enormous and shared whose purpose we can no longer read. A tower for reasons we have lost. And this keeps happening, at site after site, the further back we look. The oldest things people made together are almost never the practical things. They are the mysterious things. The monument, the wall, the tower, the buried temple. As if the first impulse that drew crowds together and held them there was never merely to survive, but to mean something, to mark something, to stand as one body before the sky and the dead and the turning year. And still, the word city refuses to land cleanly even here. Jericho around its ancient spring may have held only a few hundred people or a couple of thousand at most. That is a town, a large village, a settlement. But is it a city? It had a wall before it had a crowd worth the name. It had a tower before it had streets. If the first city must be a place of many thousands, Jericho is too small. If the first city is simply the first place people walled themselves in and stayed for good, then Jericho, beside its ceaseless spring, has as strong a claim as anywhere on earth, and a far older one than the famous names of Mesopotamia. This is the quiet trap that closes around anyone who chases this question honestly. Every candidate fails some test and passes another. Çatalhöyük had the crowd but no streets and no rulers. Göbekli Tepe had the gathering but no one lived there. Jericho had the wall and the tower but perhaps too few people. Each is a first of something. None is cleanly the first city because the word itself was made much later by people looking back, and the past did not build itself to fit our categories. The first city is not hiding. It is simply that we have never agreed on what we would recognize if we found it. The people who could have settled that argument, strangely, lived thousands of years ago and left us their answer in writing. The Sumerians, the first people we know of who kept long written records, were asked in their own way where the world of cities began. And they did not shrug. They did not say the question was too hard. They wrote down a name, plainly, as the first city that ever existed, a place, they said, that came before all the others, before kingship, before the flood that they believed had once swept the whole world away. To understand why they were so sure, and why their certainty is both beautiful and impossible to fully trust, we have to open the oldest list of names ever written and read what it says came first. The list survives on clay, in the wedge-shaped script we call cuneiform, copied and recopied by Sumerian scribes across generations. Scholars know it as the Sumerian king list, and it reads at first like a simple chronicle of who ruled where and for how long. But its opening line is not a fact. It is closer to a spell, a founding statement about the shape of the world. When kingship came down from heaven, it says, kingship was in Eridu. Before there were rulers anywhere else, before the great cities whose names would fill the tablets, there was Eridu. And into Eridu, the very idea of ordered rule descended from the sky like rain onto the plain. To the Sumerians, Eridu was not merely old, it was the first, the place where the human world as they understood it began. And Eridu was a real place. You can go to where it stood, in the marshy south of Iraq, and find its mound waiting, a low, pale rise above the flatland, called in the local tongue Abu Shahrain. Diggers have cut down into it, and what they found beneath the sand is one of the most moving things in all of this long story. At the heart of Eridu stood a temple dedicated to the god the Sumerians called Enki, the god of the deep fresh waters, of wisdom, of the sweet springs beneath the earth. And that temple had been built and rebuilt again on exactly the same spot, over and over across thousands of years. Each time it decayed or was leveled, the people raised a new one directly on top of the old, larger, grander, but never moved, never abandoned, faithful to that single sacred point of ground through the whole life of the city. Layer upon layer of temple, more than a dozen of them stacked in the same place, a column of devotion rising through time. There is something in that image that reaches across the millennia and touches something quiet in us. A people who for thousands of years would not move the holy place, who kept building the same house for the same God on the same ground their ancestors had chosen, so that the newest temple stood on the crushed remains of the oldest, and a worshipper at the top was standing, without knowing it, on the roof of a shrine raised by people 50 generations dead. It is the same pattern as the mound, the same pattern as the dead beneath the floors, the same pattern that runs through this whole story like a vein through stone. The new does not clear away the old, it settles on top of it. It is held up by it. Everything human beings build stands on the dissolved remains of what they built before. So the Sumerians handed us an answer, clear and confident. Eridu was first. And for a long time it was tempting to simply accept it, to let the oldest literate people on earth settle a question about their own beginnings. But their certainty, beautiful as it is, cannot quite be trusted, and it is worth being honest about why. The king list was written down long after Eridu was already ancient. Its opening lines are not a memory. They are a belief about origins, a story the Sumerians told to explain how order entered the world, with Eridu as the sacred first place, the way many peoples imagine a first garden or a first mountain. And the list goes on, after Eridu, to name kings who supposedly reigned for tens of thousands of years each, one for 28,000 years, another for 36,000. Impossible spans that reveal at once that this is not a sober record of dates, but something closer to scripture. A mingling of the real and the mythic that we cannot cleanly pull apart. That does not mean the Sumerians were wrong about Eridu. It may well be one of the oldest true cities of the southern plain, and the reverence they held for it may preserve a genuine memory of a genuine beginning, faithfully passed down. But it means their answer is a door, not a floor. Because when the diggers went down through Eridu's layers, through temple beneath temple, they did not reach a clean beginning where the story politely started. They reached older settlement beneath the oldest temple. Simpler, humbler traces of people living on that spot before the first shrine was ever raised. The first city named by the first people to keep records turns out, like all the others, to have something underneath it. Even Eridu is not the bottom. And there is a further trouble that the king list quietly reveals, one that will grow larger the deeper we go. The list does not name only Eridu. It names a handful of cities that supposedly held kingship in turn before the Great Flood. Eridu first, then others after it, each taking the sacred rule for a time. Which means that even to the Sumerians, the first city was not alone. It sat at the head of a line of near equals, other ancient cities crowding close behind it, each old enough to belong in a list of the world's first places. And that hints at something the neat idea of a single first city cannot hold. What if there was never one first city at all? What if, across the plain, along the rivers, in more than one place at once, people were crossing the same threshold in the same centuries, so that the true answer is not a name but a scattering? Many firsts, none of them the first, all of them beginning together in the dark. Before that unsettling possibility can be faced, there is one city whose ruins are so vast, whose name is so bound up with the very invention of writing, that it is more often crowned the first true city than any other. And it is the city that first learned to write down its own name. Uruk stood on the Euphrates in the south of Mesopotamia, and at its height, more than 5,000 years ago, nothing else on the planet was like it. Where earlier settlements had held hundreds or a few thousand, Uruk swelled to tens of thousands of people, packed within a great wall that ran for miles around the city. It had monumental buildings raised on purpose to overawe, temple platforms climbing toward the sky, whole districts given over to gods and to administration. It had specialists, potters and weavers and metalworkers and scribes who did nothing but their craft, fed by the grain of farmers they would never meet. It had, in every sense the word can bear, become a city, fully and unmistakably, the first place we can point to where the whole apparatus of urban life stands complete before us in the ground. When people speak of the first city and want a single, confident answer, Uruk is the name most often spoken. At its heart rose the district the Sumerians called Eanna, the house of heaven, sacred to the goddess Inanna, and near it stood a great platform crowned by a temple whose plastered walls once shone white above the mud-brick city, visible across the flat land for a great distance, a beacon of the place where earth reached toward the divine. To stand at the foot of that platform, one ancient among tens of thousands, must have produced a feeling few humans before that age had ever known. The feeling of being small within something made entirely by human hands, dwarfed not by a mountain or a storm, but by the sheer collective will of your own kind. That feeling, that particular smallness inside a human-made vastness, may be one of the truest marks of the city. It is a feeling most of us still know, standing beneath towers in the cities we live in now. It began somewhere. Uruk is one of the oldest places we can prove it was felt, and Uruk did something no place before it is known to have done, something that changes everything about how we can ever answer the question of the first city. It learned to write. In the storerooms and temple offices of Uruk, scribes pressed the ends of reeds into wet clay to keep track of things, of grain and beer and sheep and cloth, of who owed what to whom, of what came into the temple and what went out. The first writing was not poetry, it was not prayer, it was accounting. Lists of goods, counts of animals, records of debt, the humble bookkeeping of a place too large to hold its transactions in memory. But those little clay tablets, scratched with the tally of a harvest, are the first time in the whole history of the species that human beings found a way to make thought outlast the mouth that spoke it. Writing was born in the city, of the city's need to remember what no single mind could hold. Consider what that means, because it is the strange hinge on which this entire mystery turns. Writing did not create the city created writing. People built Uruk and lived crowded in it for generations before anyone in it ever wrote a word. The tablets come late in the story of the city, not early, and the same is true everywhere. In every place where writing arose on its own, it arose inside an already existing urban world, invented to serve the machinery of a crowd that had grown too big for spoken memory. The city is older than the record of the city, every single time. And so we arrive at the quiet paradox that sits beneath this whole question, the reason the first city can never simply be looked up and confirmed. The first city, whatever and wherever it was, existed before writing. It had to. Writing is a thing that cities do once they are already cities, once they are already large and old and complicated enough to need it, which means that at the very moment the first city came into being, the first time people crossed the threshold into that new crowded life among strangers, there was no one able to write down that it had happened. There was no scribe to press into the clay. Here, now, we have become the first city. The event that we most want recorded is the one event that, by its very nature, could not record itself. The first city was mute, not by accident, not by loss, but by the order of things. It came before the tool that would have let it name itself. By the time anyone could write, the first city was already ancestral, already half-remembered, already perhaps a mound. Uruk could write its own name into the wet clay, and so we know it, and it has come down to us across 5,000 years. But every place older than Uruk, every earlier crossing of the threshold, every Çatalhöyük and Jericho, and every nameless settlement dissolved back into the plain before them, passed into and out of existence in total silence, unable to leave us so much as a single word about itself. This is why the answer keeps receding as we dig. It is not that the first city is well hidden. It is that the first city could never speak, and everything that could speak came afterward. We are trying to hear the name of something that fell silent before language learned to last. And that silence has a physical shape, out on the plain, in the very material those first cities were made of. A material so humble, so patient, so quietly devouring, that it may have swallowed the true first city so completely that no shovel will ever reach it. To understand how a whole city can vanish without a trace, you have to understand what happens to sun-dried clay when the rains come, and when the river that gave a city life decides, one slow century, to move. Sun-dried mud brick is one of the oldest and most honest building materials on Earth. You take the clay the river lays down each flood, mix it with straw and water, press it into molds, and leave it in the sun to harden. Within days you have a brick strong enough to stack into a wall that will stand for generations. It costs nothing but labor. It needs no forest cut down, no stone quarried and hauled. On the treeless, stoneless plains between the rivers, it was the perfect gift, and whole cities of hundreds of thousands of these bricks rose from the mud they were made of. But mud brick keeps a secret bargain with the sky. It came from the earth by drying, and it returns to the earth by wetting. A wall of sun-dried brick, left untended, does not fall in a dramatic collapse. It softens. Each rain rounds its edges a little more. Each year it slumps a little lower, until what was a sharp-cornered house becomes a low mud ridge, and then a swelling in the ground, and then simply part of the plain again, indistinguishable from the earth it was born from. This is the quiet engine that built the tells, and it is also the quiet engine that can erase a city as though it had never been. A place left by its people does not wait patiently to be discovered. It dissolves. Given enough centuries of rain and wind, and the slow work of roots and burrowing things, a city of mud can flatten to almost nothing, its outline gone, its bricks returned to the mud they were pressed from, until only the trained eye catching a scatter of old pottery on the surface might guess that anything human ever stood there at all. The material that made the first cities possible is the same material that could make the first city unfindable. It is a beautiful and terrible arrangement. The earth gave people the means to build, on the condition that it could one day take the building back, and the rivers made their own contribution to the vanishing. The Tigris and the Euphrates are not fixed lines on a map. They are living, wandering things, heavy with silt, and over centuries they shift their beds, swinging across the flat plain, abandoning old channels and cutting new ones. A city was born on the bank of a river because the river was its life, its water, its fields, its road, its trade. But when the river, in its slow indifference, wandered away, the city was left stranded on a dry channel, its lifeline gone. That is what happened to some of the greatest names of the ancient South. Eridu and Uruk and others eventually found themselves marooned as the water drew off elsewhere, their fields drying, their people drifting away, until the once great cities stood empty on a plain that no longer had any reason to hold anyone. They did not fall to armies. The river simply left, and life followed the water, and the mud went back to being mud. Now hold that thought against the question of the first city, and feel how heavy it becomes. If the earliest cities were the smallest, the humblest, the least monumental, for the first crossings of the threshold surely were modest, a few thousand souls at most, with no great white temple to leave a lasting mark, then they were also the most fragile, the most easily dissolved, the most likely to have melted back into the plain long ago. The grand later cities like Uruk left mounds large enough to notice, but the true first city, small and early, and made entirely of the perishable mud of the riverbank, may have vanished so completely, so long ago, that its mound is unremarkable, unnoticed, indistinguishable from the 10,000 low rises that dimple the plain of Mesopotamia. Or it may lie beneath the silt of a river that later flowed over it, buried under later floods, sealed away below the water table where no excavation can easily reach. There are thousands of these mounds across the ancient Near East. Thousands. Most have never been dug, and most never will be, because there are not enough lifetimes or hands to excavate them all, and each careful excavation takes decades and destroys the very layers it reveals. Every one of those unexamined mounds is a compressed city, a folded life, holding names and flaws and buried dead, and perhaps the answer to a question, and almost all of them will keep their contents until long after everyone now alive is gone. The plain between the rivers is a vast archive of dissolved cities, mostly unread, and the first page of that archive, if it survives at all, is somewhere in the stack, unmarked, waiting for a reader who may never come. It is a strange and quieting thing to sit with, this image of a whole landscape thick with buried beginnings, the ground itself heavy with unnamed cities. The first city might be under a modern village, under a wheat field, under the very silt a farmer ploughs this season without a thought. It might have been quietly bulldozed for a road. It might be perfectly preserved and utterly unreachable, 10 meters down in the wet dark, holding its secret with the patience only the earth can keep. We are not missing the first city because someone hid it. We are missing it because the world is enormous and the mud is patient, and the true beginning was small and early and made of the most forgettable stuff there is. And yet, even as one answer dissolves, another kind of trouble rises in its place. A trouble not of a lost single city, but of too many beginnings. For when archaeologists turned their attention north, away from the famous southern plain where everyone had always looked, they found something that quietly undid the whole idea of a single cradle where the first city was born. For a long time, the story of the first city was a story of the south. Everyone agreed on the shape of it. Down in the marshy delta where the two rivers neared the sea, at Eridu and Uruk and their neighbors, the city was invented, and from that single cradle the idea spread outward across the ancient world like a light kindled in one place and carried everywhere else. It was a satisfying picture, one birthplace, one origin, one first flame. But then the excavators went north, up into the drier plains of what is now northeastern Syria, to a great mound called Tel Brak, and the tidy picture began to come apart. Tel Brak, it turned out, had grown into a sprawling settlement at least as early as the great cities of the south, perhaps earlier, spreading out across the land in a way no one had expected so far from the supposed cradle, and its growth did not seem to follow the southern model. Rather than a city radiating outward from a single powerful center, a temple or a palace at the heart with the population gathered obediently around it, Tel Brak appears to have grown from the edges inward, separate communities on the outskirts slowly merging, coalescing into something large, as if the city assembled itself from many smaller pieces drifting together rather than being founded by any single will. It was urban life arising by a different route, in a different place, at roughly the same deep moment. Not a light carried north from the south. A second fire, lit on its own. Among the things pulled from the ground at Tel Brak are small carved figures that have haunted everyone who has seen them, the eye idols. They are simple flat pieces of stone or bone, a body reduced almost to a plaque, and above it a pair of enormous staring eyes, sometimes a single pair, sometimes eyes within eyes, sometimes a whole family of eyes stacked together. Thousands of them were found. No one knows for certain what they were. Offerings perhaps left at a shrine, images of a watching god, stand-ins for worshippers who wanted to leave their gaze fixed forever on the holy place. But their effect, laid out in rows in the pale light of a museum case, is unforgettable. Row upon row of wide ancient eyes, staring out of the very dawn of city life, as if the first cities had left behind not their voices, which they never had, but their eyes, the sense of being watched, of watching, that comes when human beings first live surrounded on all sides by others they do not know. What Tel Brak did to the question of the first city was profound and unsettling, and it goes far beyond one site. It suggested that the city was not invented once. It may have been invented several times in several places by people who never met, each group crossing the same threshold on their own, drawn by the same pressures of growing numbers and settled fields and the deep human pull toward one another, arriving independently at the same astonishing thing. The crowd made permanent, the settlement of strangers. And if that is true, then the search for the single first city is chasing something that never existed. There was no one cradle, no first flame passed hand to hand. There were beginnings in the plural, scattered across a wide and fertile arc of the ancient world. Each of them a first, none of them the first. This is a harder emptiness to sit with than a merely lost city, and it is worth being honest about how it changes the whole shape of the question. When you search for a single lost thing, at least the thing is real. It exists somewhere, whole, waiting, and your failure to find it is only a failure of reach. But if there were many firsts, then the very object of the search dissolves. The first city becomes less like a buried treasure and more like the first sunrise, or the first words spoken in a language, or the first person to feel a particular feeling, an event that surely happened, that must have happened, but that happened in so many places and so gradually and so without ceremony that pointing to a single one of them and calling it the origin is a kind of gentle fiction we tell to make the past hold still. And notice how this echoes what the Sumerians themselves half admitted in their oldest list. They did not name one city and stop. They named Eridu first, and then a line of other ancient cities close behind it, each holding the sacred rule in turn before the flood, as if even they, looking back from thousands of years ago, could not quite reduce the beginning to a single place. Their own memory held a crowd of first cities, jostling at the edge of history, and perhaps that was not confusion but accuracy, a faithful memory of a beginning that was always plural, always several, always more than one. So the ground itself refuses us a single answer, and the oldest records refuse us a single answer, and the material the cities were made of has quietly erased most of the evidence we would need to choose between them. The mystery is not closing as we press on it. It is opening, widening, growing stranger the deeper we look, exactly as the great questions do. And it is about to grow stranger still. Because if the city was invented more than once in the ancient Near East, then what happened when human beings on the far side of the world, who could not possibly have heard of Eridu or Uruk or Tel Brak, who lived on other continents separated by oceans and deserts and thousands of years, arrived entirely on their own, at the very same idea? Far to the east, in the valley of the Indus and its lost sister river, cities rose that owed nothing to Mesopotamia. Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa spread across the plains of what is now Pakistan and northwestern India, and they were cities of a kind the Western world would not match for a very long time. They were laid out on grids, with streets meeting at right angles as though planned by a single mind. They had covered drains running beneath the streets, brick-lined wells, bathing platforms, a whole quiet genius of water and cleanliness built into the very bones of the city. And in the ground beneath them, at a place called Mehrgarh, lie the traces of farming villages stretching back many thousands of years, a slow local road toward the city that ran entirely on its own, with no need of any spark carried from the rivers of the West. Here was urban life invented again in its own way, with its own obsessions, by people who had surely never heard the name of Uruk. And the Indus cities kept a secret that deepens this whole mystery rather than solving it. They left behind a script, small, elegant signs carved on seals and pressed into clay, and no one alive can read it. It has never been deciphered. We do not know what language it recorded, what the signs meant, what these people called themselves or their cities or their gods. One of the great early urban civilizations of the world speaks to us in a writing we cannot understand, so that even where the first cities did learn to leave a record, that record can fall as silent as the ones that never wrote at all. The seals stare up at us covered in meaning, and the meaning is gone. It is the same silence in a different form. Even writing, that fragile miracle, is no guarantee that a city's own voice will reach us. Cross the world entirely, to the desert coast of Peru, and the strangeness deepens once more. In a dry valley not far from the Pacific, at a place called Corral, people raised great platform mounds and sunken circular plazas thousands of years ago, at a time astonishingly close to the age of the pyramids of Egypt, in a part of the world that had no contact whatsoever with any of the old centers of the Eastern Hemisphere. And here, the story bends in a way that troubles our neat assumptions all over again. The people of Corral, it seems, built their monumental city with very little sign of the pottery and even the intensive grain farming that we so often treat as the necessary foundation of urban life. They fished the rich coastal waters and grew cotton to make the nets, and on that unexpected base, they raised a complex monument-building society in near total isolation from the rest of humanity. The city, it turns out, does not require any single recipe. Humans found more than one road to it, on more than one continent, out of more than one way of feeding themselves. Look at the whole picture from a great height, and something extraordinary comes into view. Across the world, at different times, on different continents, separated by oceans they could not cross, and thousands of years they could not bridge, human beings kept arriving at the same invention. The city, the permanent crowd, the gathering of strangers behind a shared boundary, with all the wonder and burden that follows from it. Mesopotamia found it. The Indus found it. The people of the Peruvian coast found it. Later, in the valleys of China and in the highlands and jungles of the Americas, others found it too, each on their own, each without instruction. It is as though the city is not so much an idea that had to be invented and spread, but a shape that human life falls into whenever the conditions allow, a form waiting inside us that emerges again and again wherever enough people gather in a fertile place for long enough. And that turns the question of the first city inside out one final time. If the city is something humanity keeps reinventing, a threshold our species crosses over and over whenever it can, then asking which city was first begins to feel like asking which raindrop first fell in a storm that soaked the whole world. There is an answer somewhere, in principle. One settlement really was, in cold fact, the earliest of them all. The very first place on Earth where people crossed that line. But it is buried inside a phenomenon so widespread, so natural to our kind, so many times repeated, that the single first instance is almost drowned in the flood of all the others that followed the same deep pattern. The first city is real. It is also nearly lost inside the truth that the city was never a one-time miracle, but a thing we are built to build. So we are left holding two hard truths at once. The first city was mute and small and made of dissolving mud, and probably vanished long ago beyond any hope of finding. And even if we found it, the very idea of a single first is strained almost to breaking by the discovery that cities were born many times, in many places, by people who never met. The mystery has not narrowed, it has bloomed. And beneath both of these troubles lies a third, quieter one, the deepest of them all, which we have circled the whole way without quite landing on. Before we can ever say which was the first city, we have to answer a question that turns out to have no firm floor at all. We have to say what a city even is. And the harder anyone has tried to pin that down, the more it has slipped away. Ask what makes a city, and the first answers come easily, and each one falls apart in the hand. Size, someone says. A city is simply a very large settlement. But how large? Draw the line at a few thousand, and Çatalhöyük becomes a city, while a modest town of 2,000 does not, which feels arbitrary the moment you say it. Draw it higher, and you rule out places everyone's instinct calls cities. There is no natural number, no threshold the past agreed to, only a line we choose and then pretend we discovered. Size will not do it. The crowd alone does not make the city. Then perhaps it is the wall someone offers. A city is a settlement that has enclosed itself, drawn a boundary between inside and outside. But Jericho had its wall when it was barely a large village, and Çatalhöyük, that honeycomb of thousands, seems to have had no wall at all, its outer houses simply forming the edge of the town with their own blank backs. Some cities walled themselves and some did not, in every age, and the wall turns out to be a choice about defense and definition, not the essence of the thing. Then it is the monument, another suggests, the great temple or palace that marks a settlement as a city. But Göbekli Tepe raised its monument with no city around it at all, and Çatalhöyük raised none and was a crowd regardless. Then it is writing, says another. And we have already seen that fail most completely of all. For the city always came first and the writing after, so that the earliest cities everywhere were cities before a single word was set down. One by one the tidy markers fall. Size, wall, monument, writing, kingship, streets, for every feature someone names as the mark of a true city, there is an ancient place that had it without being much of a city, and another that was unmistakably a city without it. The past simply did not build itself to a checklist. It grew in 1,000 local ways towards something that we, looking back from very far away, gather under a single word. And the word is ours. The word city is a net we cast backward over an enormous, varied, gradual thing, and the net was woven long after the fish had swum. This is the deepest reason the first city can never be cleanly found, deeper than the mud and the silence and the many origins. It is that the thing we are looking for has no sharp edge. A city is not a kind of object like a sword or a coin that either is or is not present. It is a threshold in a slow process, a point along a continuous slope from the family, to the band, to the hamlet, to the village, to the town, to the something more that we finally agree to call a city. And a threshold on a slope has no natural location. It is wherever the observer decides to draw the line. Move the line a little, and a different settlement becomes the first. The first city is not a fact waiting in the ground. It is partly a decision made in the present about a word, applied to a past that never knew the word existed. There is something almost vertiginous in following this all the way down. We began by asking a simple question, where was the first city, expecting that somewhere under some mound lay a definite answer, a real place that was really the first. And we find instead that the answer depends on a definition we cannot fix, applied to a process without a sharp beginning, most of whose evidence has dissolved into mud, that happened independently in many places, before anyone could write it down. The question does not have a hidden answer that clever digging will one day reveal. The question has, woven into it, a softness that no amount of digging can harden. The the first city recedes not only because it is buried, but because it is, in part, a thing we are still in the act of defining. And yet, and this matters, or the whole long search would collapse into mere fog, none of this means the first city is unreal, or that the question is empty, or that nothing actually happened. Something did happen. However blurred its edges, however many times it happened, however impossible to pin to a single mound, there really was a stretch of centuries, somewhere on the fertile earth, when human beings crossed for the first time from one way of living into another, from the world of the known face to the world of the stranger, from the village where every neighbor had a name to the crowd where most never would. That crossing was real. It changed our species forever. Every person listening to this in a city tonight is living on the far side of that threshold, whether they can name the day it was crossed or not.
So the honest thing is not to give up the question, but to change what we are asking of it. We may never point to a mound and say, "Here, this was the first city." But we can ask what that crossing did to the human beings who made it. We can ask what changed in the soul and in the days when people first became a crowd of strangers. And here, at last, the mystery stops receding and turns to face us, because the answer is not buried in the ground at all. The answer is in us. It is in the way we live now, in the loneliness and the freedom of the modern city, in feelings so familiar we no longer notice them. The first city left one record after all, not in clay, not in stone, but in what it made of us.
For nearly the whole of the human story before the city, a person lived their entire life among people they knew. In a band of hunters, in a village of farmers, the faces around you were the faces you had always known. Kin, neighbors, the same few dozen or few hundred souls, cradle to grave. You knew their parents and their children. They knew yours. There was no such thing as a stranger who lived beside you, because anyone who lived beside you was, by that very fact, not a stranger. The city ended that, and it ended it forever. To walk through Uruk 5,000 years ago was to pass, in a single afternoon, more human faces than a village dweller might see in a lifetime, and to know that you would never learn the names of almost any of them. The city invented the permanent stranger. It invented the crowd. It invented the particular experience, so ordinary to us now that we cannot feel how strange it once was, of being surrounded by our own kind and utterly unknown among them.
Everything that we think of as urban flows from that one change. When you live among people you know, trust is personal. You help your neighbor because they are your neighbor, and the whole web of who owes what to whom is held in living memory and the bonds of kin. But when you live among strangers, that web snaps. You cannot remember your obligations to 10,000 people you have never met. And so the city had to invent new ways to hold together what the village had held by acquaintance alone. It invented the written record, the tally of debts, the counting of grain owed and grain paid, precisely because trust could no longer be personal and had to become something written down, something outside any single memory. Accounting was not a dry accident of city life. It was the city's answer to the loss of the known face. Writing itself, that world-changing miracle was born as a crutch for a species that had grown too crowded to remember its own promises, and the same pressure gave us law. In the village, disputes were settled by people who knew both sides, by elders who had watched the quarrelers grow up, by the soft weight of a whole community's memory. Among strangers, that fails. When two people who will never see each other again come into conflict, when the offender can vanish into the anonymous crowd, the old face-to-face justice cannot work. The city needed a justice that stood above any particular person, that applied to strangers as coldly as to kin, that was written down and fixed so that it did not depend on anyone knowing anyone. Out of the crowd of strangers came the very idea of law as a thing above persons, and eventually the great inscribed codes that would be carved on stone and set up in public for all to read. The stranger created the law, because only strangers need a justice that does not know their names. Feel how much of your own life this touches, even now, even tonight. When you walk down a street in a city and pass 100 people whose faces you will never see again and whose lives you will never know, you are doing something no human being did for the first 100,000 years of our existence. When you trust a stranger to honor a contract or obey a law made by people you have never met, or move through a crowd feeling both wonderfully free and quietly, achingly alone, you are living inside the invention of the first city. That mingled feeling, the freedom and the loneliness braided together, the sense of being anonymous and unwatched, and therefore both liberated and unmoored, is not a modern neurosis. It is old. It is as old as the first crowd. The first people to feel truly alone in a multitude were the first citizens, and we have never stopped feeling it since. This is the record the first city left, the one that no mud could dissolve and no shifting river could bury. It did not write its name, but it wrote itself into the deepest patterns of how human beings live together, and those patterns have been copied faithfully, generation to generation, for thousands of years, all the way down to the room you are lying in tonight. You are the inheritor of that first crossing. The loneliness you may have felt in a crowd, the strange comfort of being no one in particular on a busy street, the trust you place every day in the promises of people you will never meet. All of it was born when the first strangers agreed, somehow, to live together behind a shared boundary. That is why this question matters, why it is not merely an antiquarian puzzle about old mounds. The first city is the founding of the world we still live in. We are its children, even those of us who have never wondered where it stood.
And there is one more thing the first city left us, more fragile than law and stranger than accounting. A memory. Not a record, but a memory. The kind that survives in stories rather than in clay, worn smooth and half-transformed by thousands of years of retelling until it becomes something between history and myth. For many peoples carried, in their oldest tales, a dim recollection of a first place, a beginning city, a first order of the world, often set before some great catastrophe that wiped the slate and forced the world to start again. These stories are not reliable history, but they are not nothing either. They may be the faintest echo, distorted almost past recognition, of the true and unrecorded beginning, the human memory of the first city, surviving the only way a memory can survive when there is no writing yet to hold it, folded into the shape of a myth. The oldest stories of Mesopotamia return again and again to a great flood. Long before the flood story reached the pages of the Bible, the Sumerians and the peoples who followed them told of a deluge that once drowned the world, sent by the gods, surviving only through a single righteous man warned in time who built a vessel and carried the seeds of life through the waters. And the flood in these stories is not merely a disaster, it is a divider. There is a world before the flood and a world after it, and the cities of the deep beginning, Eridu among them, belong to the time before, the antediluvian age, the era of the first things, when the reigns of kings stretched to tens of thousands of years and the ordinary rules of time did not yet seem to apply. The flood washes that first world away, and history as the Sumerians understood it begins again on the far side of the water.
It is worth asking gently what such a memory might be made of. Not because these stories are literal history. The reigns of 36,000 years alone tell us we are in the country of myth, not chronicle. But because a memory this widespread, this deep, this insistent on a first age divided from ours by a catastrophe may be built around a grain of something real, ground down and mythologized by the long passage of time. The southern plain of Mesopotamia is a land of floods. Its whole life depended on the rivers, and its whole terror was of the rivers rising. Great floods surely came more than once, drowning fields and villages and perhaps whole early settlements, and the memory of such disasters, passed down for generations before anyone could write, would swell and merge and take on the shape of a single world-ending deluge that separated the first age from all that followed. And notice what the flood does to the memory of the first city. It places it on the other side of an uncrossable divide. The first cities in the Sumerian imagination are before the flood, which is to say, in a time that can no longer be reached, a time washed away, remembered only in the impossible rain lengths of legend. Whether or not any real flood ever cut the record in two, the story captures something true about the first city's place in memory. It is on the far shore. It belongs to a beginning we can point toward but never quite reach, glimpsed across a great gap of dissolved time. Its details already turned to legend by the time anyone could write them down. The myth of the flood is, in a way, an honest confession of the very problem we have been circling all along. The first things are on the other side of a divide that memory cannot fully cross.
Other peoples, in other lands, kept their own versions of this ache. A first place, a first garden, a first home from which the world descended and from which it is now cut off. The Sumerians spoke also of Dilmun, a pure and distant land where the world was clean and death had not yet come, a paradise of beginnings set apart from the ordinary world of cities and toil. Elsewhere there are first gardens, first mountains, first islands, first homes of the ancestors, always somewhere back at the root of things, always somehow lost or sealed off or drowned or left behind. It would be too much to say these are all memories of the first city. They are not, but they share a shape with our question, and the shape itself is telling. Human beings across the whole world seem to carry a sense that there was a first place, a beginning that mattered, and that we are now separated from it, that the origin is real and precious and gone.
That shared ache may not be evidence of any particular lost city, but something even more interesting. It may be the trace, in the deepest layers of human memory and imagination, of the crossing itself, the dim, transmuted recollection of the time before the city, when the world was smaller and every face was known, before we became a species of strangers in crowds. The longing for a first garden, a lost purity, a home we can never return to, may be in part the memory of the village world our ancestors left behind when they built the first cities and became forever the people of the crowd. We built the city and gained everything the city gives, and something in us has grieved the smaller known world ever since, and turned that grief into stories of a paradise before the fall. If that is so, then the first city left its record in stranger places than clay tablets and dissolving walls. It left it in the shape of our myths, in the persistent human feeling that the beginning is real but unreachable, that we came from somewhere first and can no longer find our way back. Every story of a lost first home may carry, buried inside it, the true and unrecordable fact that our species once crossed a threshold it could never uncross, and has been telling itself stories about the far side ever since. We have followed the first city down through mound and definition and myth, and everywhere the same truth has met us. It is real and it is receding. It happened and it cannot be located. It made us what we are, and it did not leave its name. So what in the end can honestly be said? Not a triumphant discovery, not a mound at last identified with the words "the first city." The evidence will not bear that, and to claim it would be to betray everything this long search has taught. But something can be said, something quiet and true, and perhaps more haunting than any single answer. And it begins by admitting the one thing we can be almost certain of about the people who founded the first city.
They did not know. That is the one thing we can say with real confidence about the people who built the first city, that not a single one of them knew they were doing it. There was no founding day, no ceremony, no moment when the elders stood upon a rooftop and declared that here now, the first city in the history of the world was being born. It could not have happened that way, because no one living had any way of knowing that what they were making had never been made before. They had no word for city. They had no concept of a threshold being crossed. They were only doing what people had always done, a little more of it than before. Building another house against the neighbour's wall because the good land by the water was filling up, taking in another family fleeing a failed harvest, staying another year and another, because the fields were good and the spring was sweet and there was no reason to leave.
The first city was not founded, it accumulated. It thickened slowly out of ordinary choices made by ordinary people for ordinary reasons, none of them aware that the sum of all their small stayings was something the world had never held. One generation's slightly larger village became the next generation's crowd, and somewhere in that unhurried thickening, without anyone noticing, without any possible way for anyone to notice, the line was crossed. A place that was not quite a city became a place that was. And the people who lived through that crossing went to sleep each night in their smoke-dark rooms with no idea that they were the first of a new kind of human being, the first citizens, the first of the countless billions who would ever after live their lives among strangers. There is something almost unbearably moving in that, if you let it settle in the quiet. The most important threshold in the whole social history of our species was crossed by people who could not know they were crossing it, and who left, therefore, no mark of the crossing at all. No monument, no record, not even a memory clear enough to survive. The founding of the world we live in was invisible even to its founders. They were too close to it. You cannot see that you are standing at the beginning of everything when, to you, it is simply Tuesday. Simply another season, simply the ordinary business of staying alive in a good place beside the water. And this at last is the honest shape of the answer, the thing that can truly be said when all the false certainties have been set aside. The first city almost certainly cannot be found and named, not because anyone hid it, but because it was small and early and made of dissolving mud, and mute by the very order of things, and born so gradually that even its own people did not know it had been born. It lies, if it lies anywhere still, under silt and later floods and thousands of years, one unremarkable swelling among the countless mounds that dimple the plains between the rivers, holding its silence the way the earth holds all its oldest secrets, patiently, completely, and without the least concern for our wanting to know. We can say that it was. We can say roughly when and roughly where, in that fertile arc where farming and gathering and staying first thickened into the permanent crowd. We cannot say its name because it never had the chance to speak one. But notice what has quietly happened over the course of this long search. We set out looking for a place, a mound, a name, a dot we could put on a map and say there. And the deeper we looked, the more the answer refused to be a place at all, and became instead something else. A moment in the life of our whole species, a crossing, a change in what it means to be a human being, living among other human beings. And that, it turns out, is not lost at all, that we carry with us. The first city, as a specific buried settlement, is very likely gone beyond recovery. But the first city, as the event that made us a species of strangers in crowds, of writing and law and loneliness and freedom, is not gone. It is the water we swim in. It is so completely present that we cannot see it, the way the founders could not see what they were founding, because we are inside it, every one of us, every day. So the question turns out to have two answers, and they point in opposite directions, and both are true. Where was the first city? Nowhere we can find. Under the mud, dissolved, unnamed, lost. And also, here, all around you. In the crowd you walked through today. In the trust you placed in strangers. In the very fact that you can lie in a room tonight surrounded by thousands of people you will never know, and feel it as ordinary. The first city is both the most thoroughly lost thing in human history and the most inescapably present. And the strangeness of holding both of those at once is, perhaps, the closest we will ever come to the true answer.
There remains only the last thing, the thing that all of this has been circling toward, the thought that waits at the bottom of every mound and behind every dissolved wall and beneath the floors where the first people buried their dead. It is not a fact. It is not a discovery. It is a way of seeing the ground you stand on and the cities you live in, and your own small place in the long, unbroken line of people who have built upon the ruins of the people before them, without ever once being able to see the whole of what they were part of.
Think of the city you live in, or the nearest city to wherever you are resting tonight. Beneath its streets almost certainly lie older streets. Beneath its foundations, older foundations. Nearly every long-inhabited city on Earth is built on the buried remains of earlier versions of itself, layer settling upon layer, exactly as the tells of Mesopotamia were built, only faster now and taller, and made of concrete and steel rather than sun-dried mud. Dig beneath a modern city and you find the cellars of the century before, and beneath those the footings of the century before that, and sometimes far down, a Roman wall or a medieval well or a scrap of something older still. The whole place a mound in the making, rising slowly on its own past. We have never stopped doing what the people of Eridu did when they rebuilt the temple of Enki 18 times on the same sacred ground. We build the new upon the crushed body of the old. It is simply what our kind does, which means the cities of today are tells that have not finished forming. Every place people live now is a layer in a mound whose lower floors are already buried and whose upper floors are still being walked upon by the living. And if that is true, then the strange fate of the first city is not something safely locked in the deep past. It is the fate of all cities, including the ones lit up tonight. Give it enough time, not the few thousand years that separate us from Uruk, but the deep time in which whole civilizations are brief flickers. And the cities of this age will slump and soften and rise into mounds of their own, their names growing uncertain, their languages perhaps unreadable, their monuments dissolving into swellings in some future plane. Someday, in an age we cannot imagine, someone may cut into the mound that was a great city of our own time and find our floors and our foundations and our buried things, and wonder who we were and struggle to read what we left,
and fail to learn our name.
That is not a grim thought, though it may sound like one in the dark. It is a companionable one if you let it be, because it places us in the line. It makes us not the observers of the first city, standing safely outside its story, but participants in the very same process, another layer in the endless mound, doing exactly what the first citizens did without knowing what they were part of. They could not see that they stood at the beginning of the world of cities. We cannot see the whole shape of the thing we stand in the middle of, or how it will look to those who dig it up when we are the deep buried layer, as silent to them as the first city is to us. We are as blind to our own place in the long story as they were to theirs. And there is a strange comfort in that shared blindness, a kinship across all the thousands of years, the founders who did not know they were founding, and us who do not know what we are building, both of us simply living in a good place beside the water, staying another year and another, laying down a layer for those who will come after. And here is the last turn of the thought, the one that has been waiting beneath all the others. If the first city dissolved back into the plain, unnamed and unfindable, then where exactly did it go? Not away. Nothing truly goes away. The mud brick of the first city became the mud of the plain, and that mud was taken up again by later people and pressed into new bricks and built into new cities, which dissolved in their turn and became mud again and were built again in an unbroken cycle of the same earth rising and falling and rising through thousands of years. The very ground of Mesopotamia is made in part of dissolved cities. The plain is not the stage on which the cities stood. The plain in places is the cities, all of them, ground together and returned to the earth and waiting to be raised once more. The first city is not gone, it is underfoot. It is mixed into the ground that every later city was built from. In a sense, too literal to be only poetry. We have been building on the first city all along, using its very substance, without ever knowing that the dust in our hands was once the walls of the beginning. So the search that seemed to end in loss ends somewhere stranger and gentler instead. The first city cannot be found as a place, and yet it was never truly lost, because it never left. It became the ground. It became us. It became the pattern we still live by, and the earth we still build on, and the myths we still tell of a beginning we cannot reach. Every question we asked of it turned back in the end toward here, toward now, toward the room you are lying in, and the ground beneath the city outside your window, and the long, patient, unbroken line of people who have raised their homes on the dissolved homes of the dead, since the very first of them stayed one more year beside the water. There is a rain that falls on the plains between the rivers, a soft rain, the kind that has fallen there for 10,000 years and more. It falls on the mounds, on the low brown swellings where the cities were, and it does what it has always done. It softens the old bricks a little more. It carries a little more of the past down into the earth. And it waters too, whatever grows there now.
The rain does not hurry. It has no reason to. It has watched cities rise on this plain, and it has watched them go back down into it, and it treats them all the same, the first and the last, the great and the forgotten, wearing them each a little smoother with a patience no human life is long enough to feel. Somewhere out on that flat and quiet land, under one of the low mounds no one has ever dug, the beginning may still be sleeping, the first floor ever laid, the first wall ever shared, the first threshold anyone ever crossed from the known world into the world of strangers. Or it may be gone entirely, ground into the soil, drawn up into a stalk of wheat, carried off in a river that no longer even remembers the name of the channel it once was. There is no way to know which. And in the end it may not matter which, because the not knowing has its own kind of fullness, the way an unfinished thought held gently in the mind on the edge of sleep can feel more complete than any answer. Something in us wants a first, a single first, a real one, a place we could stand and say it began here, as if finding the exact spot of the beginning would let us finally understand the whole long story we are part of. But the beginning was never a spot. It was a slow tide of ordinary people staying one more year beside good water, thickening without knowing it into something new, and the tide left no single high water mark, only a whole coastline of mounds, each of them a first of something, none of them the first, all of them dissolving quietly back into the ground they rose from. The first city is less like a treasure buried at a known depth and more like the first moment a child became who they are, real and enormous and impossible to date, lost in a gradual becoming that no one thought to record because no one knew at the time that anything was being founded at all.
And so the people of the beginning keep their silence, and it is not a cruel silence, and it is not a silence anyone imposed. It is only the silence of those who came before the word, before the record, before there was any way to say we are here, we are first, remember us. They could not ask to be remembered. They did not know there would ever be anyone to remember them. They simply lived and built and buried their dead beneath their floors and stayed, and in the staying made the world that every city dweller since has been born into. We do not know their names. We will almost certainly never know their names, but their staying is in us, in the crowds we move through, and the strangers we trust, and the strange braided freedom and loneliness of every lit city on this turning earth. And that, perhaps, is a truer kind of remembering than any name carved in any stone.
The mounds keep their shapes in the dark. The rivers go on shifting slowly the way they always have, laying down new mud, taking old mud away, indifferent and unhurried and enormously old. Beneath the sleeping villages and the wheat fields and the pale swellings of the plain, the layers go down and down, floor beneath floor, life beneath life, all the way to a bottom no shovel has reached, and perhaps none ever will. The first floor, the first hearth, the first small room where someone lay down for the night among more strangers than any human being had ever lived among before, and slept, not knowing they were the first, not knowing anything of what they had begun, warm in the dark beside the water, while the rain came softly down and began, even then, to carry the walls back into the ground.
Maybe that is the quiet lesson the mounds have been offering all along, to anyone patient enough to sit with them in the dark. That beginnings do not announce themselves. That the most important things we ever do are often the things we cannot see the size of while we are doing them. That the founders of worlds are usually just people staying one more year, and the great thresholds of history are crossed in ordinary weather, on ordinary evenings, by ordinary hands laying one more course of brick. There is no trumpet at the true beginning of anything. There is only the slow accumulation of small stayings, and then much later, someone looking back across the dissolved centuries, trying to find the moment it all began, and discovering that the moment has no edges, that it is everywhere and nowhere, that it is under their feet and inside their days, and woven so deeply into who they are, that they cannot stand outside it far enough to see it whole. Rest now, wherever you are, in your own small room in the long line of rooms. The ground beneath you is older than you can feel, and full of beginnings no one will ever name, and it holds you up all the same. The first city is somewhere down there, or everywhere down there, or gone into the soil and the wheat and the rivers and the shape of the very life you are living tonight. It kept no record of itself. It needs none. It is still holding up everything we build, still teaching us, without a single word, how to live among the strangers. It first gathered together beside the quiet and patient water, under the same soft rain, in the same long dark, so very long ago.